quick question before you start. I hope you'll be including it. This is Tuvia. One of maybe the greatest form of disrespect argument is when the person just ignores you, when they don't go race you, when you're not considered, they just ignore what you said. And I don't know how to deal with that. The other form of disrespect, of course, which we've seen in the US lately, is where they call your real facts fake, and they present fake facts that they call real. So I don't know how you deal with that either. So
okay, let's have Leon go ahead and introduce Daniel, and we'll have the questions at the end. Maybe Tuvia, you can post in the chat, as well as other people, post your questions as Daniel's speaking. That'll be a more efficient way of taking questions at the end. Great. Okay, we are recording.
Thanks, Karen. So it's not every day that you get to meet and learn from a masterful teacher who also happened to resurrect a Jewish holiday, a Jewish day that hadn't been commemorated for 2 millennia. There's so much that I could say about my colleague and friend, Rabbi Dr. Daniel Roth, but in keeping with the principle of Shivcho shel Adam miktzat befanav, you only say a few things about a person in front of them. I'll just say, and many of you read Daniel's bio, Daniel was a Pardes faculty member for 20 years. He founded our Center for Judaism and Conflict Resolution. And in his leadership of that center at Pardes, he developed several extremely impactful programs. A program called the Roth of Shalom Schools program that served 30 middle schools with teacher training and built curriculum. A Rodef Shalom Communities program for rabbis and lay leaders. 9 Adar, which you'll hear a lot about today. Machloket Matters, how to disagree constructively, which you've been exposed to as well. His book called Third Party Peacemakers in Judaism is due to be published by Oxford University Press this spring. And Daniel teaches at Bar Ilan University and Tel Aviv University. A year and a half ago, when Daniel left Pardes to take on, he did so to take on a very significant role directing one of the most important interreligious conflict resolution programs in Israel called Mosaica, the Religious Peace Initiative. And in this role, Daniel has taken his extensive experience in conflict resolution and applied it to Israeli society and some of the most challenging issues that Israelis face. We're delighted that Daniel continues as an adjunct faculty member. His work at Pardes endures, and the programs that he set in motion endure, and we're so grateful that the relationship with him endures as well. Thank you so much, Rabbi Dr. Daniel Roth.
Thank you. Thank you, Leon. It's such an honor and pleasure to be with everyone. Not the same thing to not be in that Beit Midrash, which is, home court for me and for my children who sorely miss learning Night Seder with me on Monday nights. We don't even know what to do without having access to the Beit Midrash. So I know you've all been learning Torah by Zoom, but this is my first time doing this with Pardes, and it's an honor to be with you in whichever way we can be together. So I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint. So in our time together, I want to address, as Leon said, the story of the 9th of Adar, which I'm calling this year, the day democracy itself was under attack. Before I get into that story, I'll just share briefly, as Leon said, I'll just share briefly what I'm involved in right now, and then we'll go into text and we'll connect everything, and I'll open up for questions. So as Leon said, the director of Mosaica does both professional conflict resolution and interreligious peace building. And on the professional conflict resolution, we support 47 community mediation and dialogue centers around the country that are part of the municipalities, 21 initiatives, including many in the Arab sector that have a lot of violence taking place, that we're deeply engaged in how to mobilize volunteer community members, religious leaders, to work to bring a culture of conflict resolution and sacred disagreement within these communities and between these communities. We have about over 1,200 volunteer mediators around the country, and we actually just had our week of mediation, which is called Dibur Chadash in Israel. It was originally called 9 Adar. On our website, it still says the original story was the 9th of Adar, but because of Purim, which is like the longest holiday on the Jewish calendar, and especially this year, it just keeps on getting longer and longer. It's competing with Pesach. It was hard to actually get the 9 Adar properly into Israeli mindset. And also, we went through a transition a few years ago after the famous case of the 3 Israeli boys who were kidnapped and murdered, and then the Palestinian boy who was subsequently burnt alive, that promoting a Jewish day of constructive conflict in Israeli society is so important. At the same time, how could we then exclude the 2 million non-Jews who live in Israel? And then we had exactly the whole dilemma of Jewish democracy. How are you inclusive but yet particular, which is something we can relate to. But in Israel, it is now known as the Israeli Week of Mediation and Dialogue. And we had over 100 events in 37 cities and thousands of people involved, even during Corona, working with events with the elderly, working with events with restorative justice, working with events of connecting rabbis to the world of mediation and their communities, connecting sheikhs and their communities. So that's one part. The other part I'll share is what Leah mentioned, is about the Religious Peace Initiative, which was founded by my boss, the president of our board, Rabbi Michael Malkior, who was a former member of the Knesset and a minister and a chief rabbi in Scandinavia, and a real pursuer of peace and justice. He oversees a bunch of different organizations, and he came to the conclusion many years ago that just including in the conversations around peace liberal, secular, like-minded thinkers from Israelis and Palestinians and internationals is not actually going to bring sustainable peace. If you want to bring real peace in one of the most difficult conflicts in the world, you have to expand the tent of the conversation and include in those that disagree and include in the conservative right-wing Islamic groups such as Hamas, Islamic Jihad on the one hand, that were excluded from the peace process traditionally, and at the other hand, to include in the right-wing religious Zionist communities that were traditionally against the left-wing liberal peacemaking process. How do they engage? How do you engage them in intra-communal conversations about this, and how do you engage them really with each other? And his partner was Sheikh Abdullah Nimr Darwish, who I could talk about for an hour, but I'm going to just mention in a minute. Sheikh Abdullah was the founder of the Islamic Jihad movement, really before anybody got started. He was already talking about having he grew up communist in Kfar Qasim, as many Israeli Arabs did, and then went through a transition to becoming religious after 1967, and led the whole Choser B'Tshuva, Ba'al Tshuva movement within the Islamic community, and founded the Islamic movement, and then secretly the first terrorist organization of Islamic Jihad. And then he went through a transition after he spent years in Israeli prisons and meeting with people during that time, that he transitioned to becoming an advocate for the Islamic movement, first running for municipal elections and then Knesset elections. Now everybody knows about his student Mansour Abbas. I don't think there's anyone in the country who hasn't heard of Mansour Abbas as the head of the Islamic list, which was his student. And in the last 20 years of his life, he advocated for religious peace. until he passed away a few years ago. And then, so our initiative is really kind of continuing on their work, which is how do you mediate between where it's most difficult? How do you engage those that that it's not obvious? And it's called academically, we call it insider mediation, as opposed to professional mediation. It's who's connected to the right people, and the right people are the people of influence, not of the right opinion, but the people who have real influence over communities. How do you engage those people into the conversation, meeting their needs, listening to their needs, and trying to bring about a real sustainable peace of people based upon values, based upon religious convictions. And I'll just introduce you to a couple people on my team. This was this picture that I just brought up was in a meeting moments before we went into a meeting a couple months ago in one of the headquarters of the Islamic movement. You can see the picture of a Sheikh Abdullah in the background, and on the far right is a rabbi who is a strong supporter of Smotrich and Ben Gvir. If you're following Israeli elections, very much part of the hardcore, more Hardali world of religious Zionism. And the sheikh in the middle is a leader in the Islamic movement, very close to Sheikh Abdullah. And the three of us work as a team of mediators. So we work very much behind the scenes in connecting those that are the most extreme, most influential in their communities, often in the mixed cities, Lod, Akko, Nazareth, where you have more Hamas, Islamic Jihad-minded Islamic communities that did not always accept Sheikh Abdullah's way of thinking, and religious Zionist communities that are really coming at it from the opposite. And the theory is, can we get those religious leaders to think together in a constructive way to work towards building religious peace locally? And also, we work on throughout the Middle East. We're being recorded, so I'll be smart. But let's just say we've developed connections with the top Islamic leaders throughout the Middle East, throughout the world, that have direct impact on our lives. To share one story, on the bottom picture here, this is right before Corona. I went with Rav Re'em Cohen, a leading rabbi in the southern hills of Hebron, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Otniel, and Sheikh Raed Badir, who's the top Islamic leader of the Islamic movement, very close to Sheikh Abdullah. And we went to speak in front of about 60 Orthodox rabbis, part of the RCA. And then we had a talk in front of all the rabbinic students in Yeshiva University. I don't know how many times Yeshiva University has allowed into their Beit Midrash a sheikh who is very close with the, let's just say, the most far from pro-Israel advocacy that you could imagine, and really included them in a conversation. And that particular moment when the picture was taken, the rabbi had just turned to the sheikh and said to him, Kvod HaSheikh, we're going to build a third temple, and I will be the one to invite you to come and pray with me at the third temple. And the sheikh said to him, Kvod Rav, he said, you know, I have to go on Al Jazeera and try to explain to 1.8 billion Muslims why you should be allowed to pray at Al Burak. What is Al Burak? The Kotel, meaning for the 1.8 billion Muslims, Jews should not be allowed to pray at the Kotel. Oh, most of them, okay? Certainly the ones in the area here. See Al Burak, the Kotel, as where Muhammad, of course, had his flying animal park, and that is a religious part of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and Jews being there is forbidden. So talk about extreme conversations, okay? But if Rav Re'em can deeply understand the narrative of Sheikh Raed, and Sheikh Raed can deeply understand the narrative of Rav Re'em, and the two of them can actually work together as close friends behind the scenes, mediating and bringing other people in their networks that are even more extreme than the two of them, that's a way forward, okay? And so our work is really always been about not just, we don't do interfaith dialogue, okay? There's a lot of conversations of people of different religious beliefs talking about their religion in people to people. That's not what we do. We do really mostly crisis management when there are life-threatening situations, because we're dealing with the people that actually have direct influence on their communities, in trying to both advance religious peace and at the same time solve crisis situations that have a life-death situation at the time. Often about Jerusalem, Harabayit al-Aqsa, those type of things. Most recently, literally the conversation I just left and the conversation I'm going into right after this session is about Corona, as you can imagine. We were approached by the World Health Organization as the only organization in all of Europe to be chosen to work as opposed to just working with the ministries of health. They said, if we're only going to work with ministries of health, we're not getting to the communities that don't trust the politicians, that don't trust the ministries of health. How can we work with religious leaders to actually advance explanations of science and especially right now the vaccine? So we are working day and night with the World Health Organization. Tomorrow we have a meeting of the top Christian leaders, top Islamic leaders, top religious Zionist leaders, top Haredi leaders, all in the same Zoom, okay, with the World Health Organization to literally get to work in plans of how each one can work separately and together. So that's just an example of the things that we're doing. And I'm happy to, I'll leave some time at the end for questions, but now let's jump into some text. But I want to say to you that the texts that we're talking about are literally always in my mind, constantly, and are being quoted in the work that we're doing. So I'll say very briefly, this conversation around constructive conflict and democracy and 9 Adar for me got started many years ago in 1993. It was like 2-3 weeks after I started my first year learning in Yeshivat Har Etzion in Gush Etzion, where I studied for 8 years. And many of you are too young to remember, but let's just say the state of civil discourse in Israeli society was at an all-time low. You had mass demonstrations on the right demonizing the left. You had mass demonstrations on the left demonizing the right, and a very deep sense of fear that something tragic was going to happen. And indeed, something tragic did happen. The prime minister was assassinated, and many things have happened subsequently to that. But the sense that, oh my God, this could never lead to violence, like that myth that a Jew could never kill another Jew, no matter how harsh the political debate could be, that myth was all of a sudden like that line can be crossed. And what was amazing for me was that inside our Beit Midrash, I was fortunate to see our Rebbeim engage in the same type of debate that they modeled of how we learn Gemara, the same way we were educated to understand conflicting different perspectives on how to read the halacha, the Mishnah, the Pasuk, whatever it was, the same way they constantly trained us to try to understand the machloket, the different opinions. They modeled around the political ideological issues of that time. And we would have Rav Yaakov Meidan stand up and explain why he was on a hunger strike. I remember in those days saying, don't give them weapons, this is going to be suicidal. And religiously it's wrong, theologically it's wrong, politically it's wrong to support the peace process. It's not a real peace process, it's only going to cause the death of thousands. And then you would have Rav Yehuda Amital, who is the founder of the left-wing religious Zionist party, together with Rabbi Malkior Meimad, arguing why this is 100% right theologically, halachically, politically, and this is a great opportunity. And even though there are risks, this is the right thing to do. But no matter what their religious or political opinion was, they modeled to us Abaye and Rava, Hillel and Shama, that these machlokot that we experienced all day and all night learning in the Beit Midrash were not just in the text, they were in the thick text of life. And watching them engage in these sacred disagreements was very important to all of us. And for me, it set me on my path of conflict resolution and on wanting to be part of constantly thinking, what can we do to strengthen the culture of constructive disagreement, not only within a particular Beit Midrash, but between the different Batei Midrash, between the different political parties. And that's the concept of machloket l'shamayim, machloket l'shem shamayim, or disagreement for the sake of heaven, that I'm going to talk about. Leon, you've heard me say this so many times, but I didn't include the text, okay? Because I've said it too many times. But those of you who know me have heard this a million, but the memtet, if you do the Machloket Matters project, you'll know this super well. But the key text of Machloket L'Shem Shamayim that I'm not going to teach today, but I'll only mention, was that every pasuk, every halacha, you had to understand it for 49 reasons to argue why the thing should be allowed, and 49 reasons to argue why the thing should be forbidden. And only after you argued the 49, that's a real machloket l'shem shamayim. That was a real disagreement for the sake of heaven, that you could then take a vote and decide which way we're going. And it was always understand your perspective, understand the perspective that disagrees with you, and then you get to vote. If you only think you have the absolute truth of, this is based upon the Yerushalmi, I'm sorry, the Yerushalmi and Sanhedrin, which I didn't translate because I'm not teaching this text. If you think you have the full truth and you have zero to learn, zero to understand of the needs, the concerns, the perspective, the knowledge, the experience of the other side, then you don't really get a right to vote in the Sanhedrin. That's how it worked. It was a condition that you would be tested in knowing the memtet, the 49, because 50 was the absolute truth. So all of that brings us to our conversation about disagreements for the sake of heaven and the story of 9 Adar. So machloket l'shem shamayim is a huge topic. We could spend hours and hours and hours learning the vast literature that talks about why it's so important and how it works, machloket l'shem shamayim. The source sheet that I'm bringing for you, you can easily find online in Elmad, the Pardes online learning center. You just type in disagreements for the sake of heaven and the story of the 9th Adar, and you can find this very simply in a PDF. But instead of doing about 5 pages of sources about Machloket L'Shem Shamayim, we're going to do 2.5 minutes of the video that we produced at Pardes. I would do a poll of how many of you have seen it, but I'm going to bet that this year not everyone has watched it. So I'm going to take down my PowerPoint and put this up and hope that you can see this as I put it up. A moment. 1 second. I have to just share the right screen. Here we go. This is what I'm about to show you is the story that is known, and it's the happy story, okay? This is the story that everyone should know about Hillel and Shama. "2,000 years ago, the Jewish world was divided between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. They seemed to disagree about everything. How to celebrate the holidays, who can marry whom, what foods can be eaten, how do we speak with people, whom do we allow into our schools, and of course, who's right? Nevertheless, the Mishnah states that they conducted the many disagreements in a healthy and constructive manner, known as disagreements for the sake of heaven. Machloket l'shem shamayim. However, the Mishnah doesn't explain what exactly about these disagreements made them for the sake of heaven. The commentaries in the Mishnah offer 4 explanations. Each one comes with a tip for engaging in constructive conflict. The first explanation: despite the sharp disagreements between the houses, they succeeded in maintaining close relationships, eating in each other's homes, and marrying with one another. So the first tip for engaging in constructive conflict is debate the issues without attacking people and damaging relationships. The second was that Hillel, Shammai, and their students had a motivation for their disagreements beyond the purpose of winning and gaining honor. Perhaps they were trying to arrive at the best solution for everyone. So the second tip for constructive conflict is check your motivations. Are you trying to win or solve problems? Point 3. In the disagreements between houses, each listened to the other side and was open to admitting they might be wrong when the evidence presented supported the other side. So the third way to engage in constructive conflict is listen to the other side and be open to admitting that you may just be wrong. The
commentaries make a fourth point. Both Hillel and Shama and their students equally spoke the words of the living God. They were both correct, despite holding opposite opinions. So the fourth tip for managing conflicts constructively is, consider that you both might be right, even though you hold opposite positions. This was how Hillel and Shammai managed their disagreements 2,000 years ago. The question is, how do we today manage our disagreements between peers, family members, neighbors, or even political parties, nations, and religions? Do we too try to maintain good relationships while disagreeing? Do we check to see if our motivations are not just about winning the argument? Are we open to admitting that we may just be wrong? Can we acknowledge that sometimes we may just both be right? Then perhaps we can also constructively manage the many conflicts and disagreements of today for the sake of heaven.
Got to show the credits. Okay. I love the fact that we did this video like, I think 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and I still get emails from teachers and things and other rabbis that it's just 2.5 minutes and it's
Yeshiva.net.
Hold on. What's happening? One moment. One second. Okay, that's a good tip to not do that. Okay, you'll cut that out of the video, Leon, that one. All right. That's the story of Hillel and Shammai that I think many people grow up knowing on one level or another, on one level of detail or another. And that's a story that we literally live and experience every day. We show up to the Beit Midrash and we see different opinions and we engage in Chavruta study. The story of 9 of Adar happened when one Friday night when I was, reading Kabbalah, doing Kabbalah Shabbat, and I didn't have anything for the Parsha, and I pulled out a Shulchan Aruch right next to me, and I just started going through fast days. I don't know. And then I saw that there was a day that I'd never heard of when Hillel and Shammai stopped doing this. So I want to just share with you briefly the story. Here we go. Okay. So this is the source sheet that we were just looking at, okay? And we just get to go through all of these pages because instead of spending 2.5 hours, we spent 2.5 minutes learning all those commentaries that we just talked about. But if you want to learn them more in depth, I strongly encourage you to do so about the relationship between Hillel and Shammai in sacred disagreements and Machloket L'Shem Shamayim. Can people see that okay? Should I make that a little bit bigger? Better? Okay. The story of the 9th of Adar gets started, as I said, in the Shulchan Aruch. I mean, we can start it there. In the Shulchan Aruch, okay, there are the laws of fast days. At the end of laws of fast days, there's a long list of like 20-something fast days that basically no one's ever heard of. One of those is the 9th of Adar. There are others, okay? Where it says, these are things that terrible things happened and we should fast in it. All it says about the 9th of Adar is, betet bo, meaning ba'adar, nichlaku beit Shammai u beit Hillel. What a shanda, what a scandal. Can you believe it? Can you imagine Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai had a disagreement? Now, what's strange about this text? Okay, we're on Zoom, so I can't make this as interactive as I would have liked. But what's strange about it is that if every time Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai had a disagreement, we declared a fast day, we would literally never get to eat, supposedly. And therefore, what's special about that machloket? So the commentaries scratch their heads. And they say, well, why fast on this particular machloket, that Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai? So there's a machloket between the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch about what was special about the machloket. So one opinion says, the Lavush, Rav Mordechai Yaffe says, you know what? This machloket that took place in the 9th of Adar that we fast for, it was L'Shem Shamayim. It was a disagreement for the sake of heaven. But you know what was special about it? It was their first machloket they've ever had. Any relationship with your significant other, with your roommate, with your who knows what, your chavruta, you have that first machloket. And then you weather it and you come out even stronger. But you always are going to remember that first machloket. And therefore, this opinion says it was as if it was a tragic thing, but the reason why we commemorate it because it was the first one, but it was still within very much the boundaries of machloket L'Shem Shamayim. And he has his source that he can cite based upon the Tosefta and Sota, which I'm not going to read right now. But then there's a different opinion on the Shulchan Aruch, the Eliyahu Rabbah, Rabbi Eliyahu Shapira, who says, no, I disagree. The machloket wasn't L'Shem Shamayim. You know what happened? He says in just 4 words, V'ne'ergu gimel alafim me'atalmidim. And 3,000 students were killed that day. Now, when 3,000 students, 3,000 followers of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are killed, that is already by definition no longer a disagreement for the sake of heaven. Because as we just described, it is not only about your motivation. You could have motivation, very holy motivation, to want to obliterate the opinion that disagrees with you, okay? But if you destroy a relationship, and some commentaries even say if you start stoning or using violence to the other side, you have broken the rules of a disagreement for the sake of heaven. That's no longer for the sake of heaven. So the Eliyahu Rabbah says, this was a moment of real violence. Now I understand why we're fasting. How does he get to 3,000? Where is he getting all this information from? Doesn't say. Doesn't say. The Aruch HaShulchan, another commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, he says, and that day was Kasher Yisrael. It was difficult. It was a terrible day, and he uses language that we're going to find seems to hint where they're getting the story from within the Talmud. And this brings us to what was the event? What were they arguing about? What brought about potentially all this violence? So this brings us to the Mishnah and Shabbat. One of the first Mishnayot in Masechet Shabbat tells a very strange story. The story is that there was once a time that the students of Hillel and the students of Shammai both met in the Aliyat Hanania ben Chizkiah ben Gurion. They went to go enact certain regulations, okay, in the attic of somebody named Hanania ben Gurion. And the rabbis came to visit him. They did a roll call. I mean, they did the vote like they always did in the Sanhedrin. It was a parliament, right? Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai were 2 political parties. And strangely, Beit Shammai were more numerous than those of Beit Hillel, and they enforced 18 regulations on that day. So 18 bills were passed in favor of Beit Shammai. So what's strange about this Mishnah, and if we were to really chavruta this properly and analyze it, we would want to ask, who's this Hanania ben Chizkiah ben Gurion? Okay, who is he? Why are they meeting in the attic? Like, was the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem under renovations? Like, why are they there? What were the 18 regulations? And why is Beit Shammai winning the vote? Like, normally Beit Shammai was a minority opinion because more people supported Beit Hillel. They were more inclusive. They were more popular amongst the people. To answer these questions, there's a debate between the Babylonian Talmud. There's a machloket between the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, okay? The Babylonian Talmud, when they look at this Mishnah, they say, look, this is what happened. They, Beit Shammai, took a sword, they took a weapon into the parliament, and they thrust it into the Beit Midrash, and they declared whoever wants to enter may enter, but no one may leave. And on that day, Hillel set sat in submission before Shammai, like one of the disciples, and it was as wretched for Israel as the day on which the golden calf was made. We're going to read the story soon of Egel HaZahav, right, in a couple of weeks. So what is that? What are we talking about? What was as terrible as the day the golden calf was made? What was terrible about the day the golden calf was made? What's the story of them bringing a sword in, but nobody seems to get hurt, right? No one's hurt. There was a warning shot. Hillel is subdued, is brought down. Is it really Hillel? Is it really Shammai? Or is it their students? What are we talking about? And what does it mean? Whoever wants to enter, but no one can leave. What's happening here? It's like something seems to be going on that we don't have the full picture, but it's like, so many members of the Beit Hillel party entered into the parliament, and then they locked the doors and no one else could come in to vote. And that's why Beit Shammai won, because there was only like 30 members of Beit Hillel and like 40 members of Beit Shammai. So they just were like, we got the majority, close it, and let's vote right now. But that seems to be, the Bavli seems to be saying something weird what happened, but nobody was actually hurt. The Jerusalem Talmud, the Yerushalmi disagrees. And they say, that day was as wretched for Israel the day the golden calf was made. Same language. Remember that. What was crazy about what was so terrible? What happened? What does this have to do with the golden calf? And Rabbi Yoshua Onia says, Talmidei Beit Shammai amdu lehem milamata v'ayu hogim b'talmidei Beit Hillel. You had the students of Beit Shammai. They're in an attic. Okay, they're in some kind of second floor of this guy Hananiah ben Chizkiah ben Gurion. We're going to talk about who he is in a moment. And they're in the attic, and you have people literally having a battle trying to get into the building. So you have the students of Beit Shammai literally killing, it says, Ayu hogim b'talmidei Beit Hillel. They were literally killing the students of Beit Hillel. And then the Braita says, Tani shisha mihem alu v'ashar amdu alehem v'charvot b'ramachim. So some of the students of Beit Shammai went in to vote, and the rest of the students of Beit Shammai are still below, physically engaging in battle with the students at Beit Hillel to not let them in to vote, to try to stop the vote. And then a comment of an Amorah, Rabbi Abu, Rabbi Yehuda B'Shem Shmuel says that Lo Shanu Din Yechol Levatel, Beit Din Yechol Levatel Gzera Shel Beit Din Acher Ela Chutz MiYudchet. These 18 regulations are unique. No future Beit Din can ever annul them, even if it's wiser and a larger assembly. You can never get rid of those 18. Why? Because they were fought over by life. Meaning, what I understand from this is, let's never go back to discuss those 18 issues. They were so controversial. They were so challenging to everybody there that we don't want to ever go back. It was decided that Beit Shammai won those votes. For whatever reason they won it, we're never going to go back and discuss those things and get rid of them. Now, on the story of the Yerushalmi, there's of course a machloket. Did that really happen? Are you serious? So the Korban Eda, if you look on one side of the page, he's like the Rashi, right? He says, when it says, when you said, and they would kill the students at Beit Hillel, what you meant is, ilu hayu rotzim lanu. That meaning it was a threat. They didn't actually kill them. It was as if, like, if they would have done it, then that's what would have happened. Aval chas v'shalom lo hagu otam. But God forbid, don't even think to take the text literally, that there was actually people killed outside of the parliament. That did not happen. But then the Pnei Moshe on the other side of the page of the Yerushalmi says, no, Mr. Korban Eda, I got news for you. They really actually was a battle. They really were killed. Shayu Beit Shammai, hogim b'talmidei Beit Hillel k'dekaman. No, they really actually did kill one another. Or Beit Shammai killed Beit Hillel, which is an interesting point that we have to discuss. So it seems likely that when the Shulchan Aruch and the commentary said Kashel Yisrael, and they come to 3,000, how do they get to the number 3,000? Where else were 3,000 people killed in a bloody civil war? Anyone know?
By Rabbi Akiva and his Bar Kokhba rebellion.
They weren't. First of all, it was 24,000 students. It wasn't 3,000. But the 3,000 wasn't them killing each other. 3,000 we have in Chet HaEgel. When you read the pasuk in Shmot, that you have Ish el Achiv, you have brother fighting against brother, friend against friend, neighbor against neighbor. You have the Levites fighting against the non-Levites, those that were in a machloket about Chet HaEgel. So it seems that the commentaries got to the number 3,000 because they said it was as difficult as the day the golden calf was created, not because of the golden calf, but because 3,000 people were killed in a civil war the day the golden calf was made, which is a radical interpretation of the tragedy of the golden calf. It wasn't the Avodah Zarah alone that was the problem. It was the civil war that ensued at that day. And therefore they say, when they say that it was that people were killed and it was as tragic as the day the golden calf was made, meaning that 3,000 students were killed just like the day the golden calf happened. So the question now is, what were they actually disagreeing about? What were these 18 things that came up for vote that everyone went crazy about, and that the Machloket Hashem Shemaim ceased to exist within the Sanhedrin? And of course, there's a Machloket over what the 18 things were. It is a huge and complicated Machloket. So I'm not going to bring you all the opinions. The Bavli has opinions, the commentaries, the medieval, we're not going to get into it. I'm going to share with you one opinion, okay, which is in the Yerushalmi. There's only one opinion in the Yerushalmi, and it's brought in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Rashbi. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, on that day, there were 18 issues that came up for vote. And they all, 18 of them, had to do with non-Jews. It had to do with how are we allowed to eat non-Jewish bread? Are you allowed to eat the non-Jewish cheese? Are you allowed to drink their wine? Are you allowed to have their vinegar, their sauces, their cooking salts, their pickled food? The first 11 all have to do with food. Can we eat with non-Jews or not eat with them? Well, how open or closed are we going to be towards socializing? 13, on their language. It's possible, according to some commentaries, that Beit Shammai was saying you're not allowed to speak the language of the occupier. You're not allowed to speak the language of the Romans, whether it be Latin or Greek. On their testimony, on their gifts, on their sons, on their daughters, and there's disagreement. Are we talking about, what are we talking about their sons and daughters? On their firstborn, they're not 100% clear what this list is. And there's a lot of disagreement. Some of them say you're not even allowed to shake hands with a non-Jew, according to Beit Shammai. Not allowed to physically touch them. You become tameh if you touch a non-Jew. And Beit Hillel said, no, I disagree. So there are all these disagreements that are very unclear to us today. But what is clear, according to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, is that they all circled around one central question. Are we going to be more particularistic and exclusive as a Jewish community, more insulated, or are we going to be more open and inclusive and in conversation with the non-Jews surrounding us? On that issue, they went to blows. They lost it. Their whole culture of Machloket Hashem Shemaim went out the window. Now the question though is, here, this we're going to skip, unfortunately. This next one we're going to skip. This was for community lunch. Traditionally, we would have a 9 Adar community lunch where we would eat foods of machloket that Chef David Berman would traditionally make for us, because there was a machloket about which foods to liken the day. So according to Rebbe Eliezer, who was Beit Shammai, he said the day should be likened to a basket full of cucumbers and gourds and mustard. And according to Beit Hillel, which is Rabbi Yoshua, he said, no, it should be full of a tub full of honey and pomegranates and nuts they're in, etc. And then the brilliant David Berman would actually make machloket muffins and conflict cookies, where he cooked the foods that Beit Shammai said the day was like, together with the foods that Beit Hillel said they were like, and we would have what would we have? We would have Israeli Arab salad. We would have sweet and sour foods. How machloket actually enhances the taste buds and doesn't detract from it. Okay, I'll take one more stop quickly into medieval time period before I talk about the historical, and then I'll open up for questions. This story, it's possible, was actually intentionally silenced. It's possible that it was sort of censored. There's a lot of different theories as to why that is. I mean, you all know that the Jerusalem Talmud is studied much less than the Babylonian Talmud, and the Jerusalem Talmud is the one that really talks about being of violence. If the violence had been in the Babylonian Talmud, maybe more people would know about it. But what is true is that the Karaites in the medieval time period, who disagreed with the rabbis of the Talmud, who didn't accept the oral tradition, right? That major machloket of the Jewish communities, the two different groups of Jewish communities in medieval time periods were the Karaites and the rabbis. And the Karaites attacked the rabbis for saying, you know, your founding fathers, the ones who wrote the constitution of the Mishnah, Hillel and Shama, they killed each other. So if they killed each other, that means they don't have any type of model that we should be learning from, right? And therefore, the Karaites are correct. These disagreements of the rabbis, this whole celebrating disagreement, it actually leads to violence and chaos. And therefore, the way to go is with the Torah shebichtav, clear, singular truth. And he said, he said that they would, Rav Saadia Gaon denied it, said it never happened. He said, I brought him the Jerusalem Talmud, and I said, look, your founding rabbis killed each other. Shame on you. How can anyone follow them? So it was actually a debate in the medieval time periods. Interestingly enough, the Rambam, Maimonides, when he tells the story, he tells it over with one slight change. He says, on that day, a miracle happened. It was the only day that Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai had no disagreement. They were in unanimous. All 70, members of Parliament of the Sanhedrin unanimously agreed to accept those 18 points. So where is the Rambam coming at that he wants to say that there was no machloket? The Rambam, parentheses, not a big fan of machloket. Okay, he really liked the singular truth idea when he, in his Mishnah Torah, and was nervous about all these differences of opinions weakening the truth of the rabbis, as opposed to celebrating the difference of opinion as strengthening truth. I want to conclude, and then I'll open up for questions with what was the historical context exactly? Like, when is this all happening, if it happened? So since Gretz, the first, of course, famous Jewish historian, until contemporary Jewish historians, the vast majority of historians believe that this happened on the eve of the Great Revolt against Rome. We're talking like the 9th of Adar in the year 66, okay? Right before they engaged in the 3+ years of battle that ended, of course, with the destruction of the Second Temple, that you have the Jews under Roman occupation saying, we're not going to normalize with these Romans and continue to live under these harsh circumstances of the occupation. We're going to fight for our independence, and we're going to do whatever it takes. And Beit Shammai joined with the Zealots that you all know, who fought in the Second Temple, who went to Masada, and Beit Shammai went with that group. And Beit Hillel, and by the way, the historians will say, you know who that Ben Gurion was? You know who they were in the attic? That's the famous Ben Gurion, or a relative of the famous Ben Gurion, who was the leader of the Zealot revolt against the Romans, right? Who later the Zionists saw as a hero because he's standing up for Jewish autonomy and doesn't want to live under occupation. And then you have, why are they walking around with weapons? Why are they in an attic? They're in hiding. It's not because of renovations. And why are they arguing about these 18 things? They're not small 18 things. The 18 things were a mashal. They were a symbol of the large political, ideological, religious debate, theological, halachic, political. Do you make peace with Rome, or do you make war with Rome? And under those issues, which express themselves as simple bills that seem technical to us, but they were larger issues at stake, that's why they really went to war. And 3 generations, we're talking Hillel and Shama lived, let's say, 1 generation before the Common Era, okay? So we're talking like 70 years, more or less, that there was a parliament of Machloket L'Shem Shamayim. There was a disagreement for the sake of heaven with a group of representatives of the different parties of the Jewish people. That also included Sadukim, it also included other smaller parties, but Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai were 2 political parties, the 2 main political parties that had created this system by Hillel and Shammai themselves of how to stay within the boundaries of sacred disagreement. And all of that was lost at that moment on the eve of the Great Revolt. There is a minority opinion amongst the historians that says, I disagree, that that's not what happened. Actually, this is according to Zachariah Franco. He says, no. What actually happened is the very first time they ever had a disagreement, it got violent. That was the 9th of Adar. That was in the very beginning of the times of Hillel and Shammai. And then over time, they learned how to create disagreement for the sake of heaven. It had nothing to do with the context of the Great Revolt. They learned that they can live with disagreement instead of only having to physically fight in battle with each other. So I bring you all these different historical events. To conclude, I'll end with one last machloket. There's a machloket actually about which day this took place. As we saw, the Shulchan Aruch going back to Gaonic time period said these events took place on the 9th of Adar, but then in certain medieval hymns that were said in synagogue, or in certain fragments that were found in the Geniza, in the Cairo Geniza, some say it was the 3rd of Adar, some say, which is, I think, today, some say it was the 4th of Adar, some say it was, so there was a machloket about which day the day of machloket happened, so we said you're all right, and that's why we call it the Jewish week of constructive conflict, so we can resolve at least that conflict. Can there be people, and this is where I'll leave you with my charge, can there be more people that grow up knowing the Beit Midrash way of thinking, that engage in complexity of text study all the time? Text study is a phenomenal conditioning of the brain because we're engaged in constant conflict over text, whether it be text messages or news text or social media. And when you are engaged in studying text, you already know this could be a different interpretation on this, a different interpretation on that, and you read the different commentaries. But instead of different commentaries of the Talmud or of the Chumash, you read the different commentaries around what's happening right now in the news. What's the right wing? What's the left wing? I have a screen. I'm not going to show it. I encourage people to read allsides.com for American news, but you can do it for Europe as well. Allsides.com. You get the whole Mikro Gedolo. And the more people that know how to argue the 49-49 and then vote and advocate for the truth, don't give them on their truth, but do it in a way that's constructive. The more people that can serve as those third-party peacemakers that are engaged in relationship with people that are on the extremes, that are engaged in understanding how to facilitate what I call narrative translation. Like you have linguistic translation, you need narrative translators. More people that can do that, the better chance we're going to have on preserving our democracies and preserving our culture. And to me, that's one of the lessons, the wake-up calls of the 9th of Adar. They were doing that for 3 generations. It was amazing, unprecedented. 3 generations, different political parties sitting in the Sanhedrin arguing. Who knew? It worked. And then one day it just got to the extremes and they killed each other and it fell apart. So how do we learn that lesson and strengthen our culture of democracy, of constructive conflict, and of the Beit Midrash? So toda rabba, b'atzlacha, and briut. Everyone should be well.